Welcome everybody to this session. We are going to start with this Truth Commissions and Sexual Violence session. I am very happy to present my colleagues that are working on this CMI Law Transform research project called Truth Commissions and Sexual Violence, African and Latin American Experiences. The panel changed a little bit. So we have here our three researchers. I'm going to introduce them. First, Elin Skaar. You are a research professor at CMI. And I want to say the topics you work on because I think it's important to locate this project within the general studies on transitional justice. So you have been working on different countries through processes of democratization, countries with human rights violations. You have worked a lot on transitional justice and court reforms and the development issues more generally. And you will present in this first panel, the first moment of this panel, the research project. We also have Lesego Sekhu, who is a research assistant in the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation, and her research interests include transitional justice with the particular focus on Africa, conflict and violence, conflict resolution, and transnational feminism and gender studies. And we have Pilar Domingo, who is now an independent researcher with a lot of experience in the legal and political field. And you all will be talking about this research project. My name is Ana Braconnier. I am the new chair of this session. And I'm from Guatemala, which is also one of the cases that Elin will talk a little bit about, at least to mention the Latin American cases. So, Elin, I have a first question for you. What is the project about? What is its particularity when you see the long history of the field of transitional justice? And what is the relevance of this project?
Okay, thank you, Anna, and thank you for chairing this panel. That was a long and a very big question, actually, and I think I would, before I go into the project and what our project is about, I would like to say something about the subject matter of our panel. It's on conflict-related sexual violence, and sexual violence sadly, is part and parcel of almost every single conflict on the planet through history, in all regions, at all times. And it is not going to go away anytime soon. We see it playing out currently in Ethiopia, in the Sudan, in Israeli prisons. Sexual violence is everywhere. So what is conflict-related sexual violence? You know, as the term implies, it's sexual violence carried out in conflict. But I will just make that a little bit more concrete for you by mentioning some of the forms that this can physically take using a definition issued by the United Nations. So conflict-related sexual violence, it may take on many different forms, but it includes rape, sexual slavery, forced prostitution, forced pregnancy, forced abortion, and forced sterilization, forced marriage, trafficking in persons, and any other form of sexual violence of comparable gravity perpetrated, and this is important, against women, men, girls, or boys that are directly or indirectly linked to a conflict. Now, in this definition, some of the victims are mentioned. Typically, we think of sexual violence as committed primarily against girls and women. But we also know from research and from experience in many conflicts that sexual violence is also directed against men, maybe in smaller numbers, but it's important. We also know that sexual violence is very often targeted at different kinds of ethnic, religious, and sexual minorities. And this, I think we have to keep this in mind when we think about how to do research on this extremely very complicated and very sensitive topic. The perpetrators of sexual violence in conflict are many. They can be individuals, they can be groups, they can be part of the state apparatus, military, soldiers, combatants, guerrilla groups, prison guards, or just ordinary civilians involved in armed conflict. Now, the consequences of sexual violence committed in conflict are very many, at the individual, at the family level, but also at the societal level. And the intention behind these kind of specific human rights violations are all negative. They are there to inflict pain, to inflict shame, to destroy the social fabric, to degrade people, and sometimes even to pass on superior genetic material when rape is used as a weapon of war. So this is the subject area of the research project that we have been engaged in now for about 4 years. We're wrapping it up very soon. And we have collected information about this topic specifically with respect to truth commissions. And why have we done that? Because after the end of conflict, whether it's an internal armed violence, whether it's an apartheid regime, whether it's a military dictatorship, usually the conflict comes to some kind of formal end with a peace agreement or a regime change. And in recent years, recent meaning the past, let's say 40 years at least, since the 1980s, countries have become more willing to address human rights violations broadly. Now, but human rights violations, of course, are not only related to sexual violence. There are a battery of violations that happen in conflict. The measures that a state can put in place after the formal conflict, or after the conflict has formally ended, include many formal institutional measures. For example, prosecuting people in the courts, reparations paid to victims, reconciliation efforts, but also truth commissions. Now, truth commissions, what are they? They are fact-finding bodies that are established for a period of time. They are not permanent bodies, and they are mandated to investigate given violations committed by certain perpetrators in a certain time period. At the end of the investigations, the commissioners appointed to these truth commissions have to write up a final report, and this report is supposed to contain recommendations to the government with two specific aims. One is reparatory, to repair the harms done, and the second is to put in place measures that will prevent these kind of violations from happening again in the future in the specific country. Okay? So the project that we have is zooming in only on truth commissions and further narrowing the research down to how truth commissions have dealt with sexual violence in conflict. And this is the big, this is actually the one big question that we have. It's like, to what extent do truth commissions address conflict-related violence, and in which ways? It sounds like a simple question. It is not very simple when you start investigating this empirically. We have looked at two regions of the world, Latin America, where Guatemala is one of our big cases, and also the African region, where we have Kenya and Sudan, I think, as the main cases, but we have done more. We have collected material on 38 truth commissions, 19 in each of the two continents, across 33 countries. All of these truth commissions are state-sponsored, which means that they have been set down by the executive or parliament. The reason for that, for narrowing it down to state-sponsored truth commissions, is that we also want to look at the recommendations that these commissions have made, and the recommendations are supposedly going to be implemented by the state, or the state is not necessarily implemented by the state, but the state is responsible for the implementation. Do you want me to say something about the methodology or the findings now or later?
Later.
Yeah, I think I've talked enough, so I'll stop it there.
Thank you for the definitions. I think they are very useful to start the conversation, also the question that leads the project. So you have a lot of empirical data, which is organized in a huge database. And I would like to ask Lesego about the methodology to start with. How do you deal with this source of data qualitatively and quantitatively? And tell us about how you have been working on that.
Okay. Hello, everyone. So this project was rather difficult. I think we underestimated the difficulty. As Elin had mentioned, very simple questions, or they seem like simple questions, but once you start actually having to engage the material itself, which ordinarily were the mandates or the final reports, you realize you may actually not have the language all the time. So we were looking at conflict-related sexual violence, but then you had other reports that will talk about gender-based violence. You had other reports that talked about sexual and gender-based violence. You had reports that only talked about rape. And so to come to some conclusion about conflict-related sexual violence is that we decided to use the UN definition. But then when you deal with the context of, well, I dealt with the African context, the UN definition itself didn't always apply. So for a case like Mauritius, it dealt with colonial violence as well. And if you read it, the manner in which sexual violence happened, the Truth Commission itself sometimes didn't even understand that that was sexual violence, or who the victims were, or who the perpetrators were. So for example, they would paint so it's enslaved persons, they would paint the man as the perpetrator of sexual violence. But when you read the larger context, you realize both the male and female in the context were both victims because they were forced to have sexual relations, and it's based on strength, it's based on all these characteristics for the larger slave industry. So those sort of language is not in like something like the UN definition. It also is something that we didn't actually even recognize until you actually engage with the material. So I think more than anything, we continuously struggled with the understanding of sexual violence and gender. And that was our primary issue in trying to systematize this data. So we had 250 plus variables, about 7 Google Forms, because we started with Excel. And we realized that you can't even see the Excel at some point because you have so much to deal with. And then we moved to Google Forms thinking it would be a lot easier to actually put this data into something readable. But then it's also difficult to have like about 150 characters to explain sexual violence that has been in a lot of the context from colonial to post-colonial context. So it's a long story, but then all of a sudden in Google Forms, you have to reduce it down to about 150 characters. And that also simplifies the context, it simplifies the people involved, it simplifies the harms involved. So, yeah, it was difficult, basically. But I can say that we're incredibly proud of the work that we have been able to do with the 38 cases. And yeah, I'm going to continue the methodology conversation with Elin.
Can I just add something, Anna? Let me just say that the Truth Commission reports have been the main source of data for this project. And we have been covering Truth Commissions from the first Truth Commission in the world, which was set down, interestingly enough, by Idi Amin in Uganda in the early 1970s. This is a commission that never publicized its report, probably because the findings were too controversial, but it is the first formal truth commission. The second one was established in Argentina after the Dirty War in the early 80s. And since then, truth commissions have been established, depending on the definition, somewhere between 70 and 120 across the world. We are covering 38. The last one we have data on in this database is the Mexican Truth Commission, but only the mandate, because the Truth Commission report was published after we finished our data collection in December 2013. Lesego mentioned the Google Forms. Now, this is like a technical data collection tool, but what we have been trying to do in this project is to collect data on the establishment of the Truth Commissions, which means contextual data. It's like, what was the conflict, who were involved, when did it happen, who are the victims, documented outside the Truth Commission reports, what were the parties involved, how did the conflict end? I mean, lots of contextual variables. And then we collected information on different phases of the Truth Commission. Now, the first phase is, how is a Truth Commission established and how is the mandate formulated, which means we collected information on the commissioners, on the mandate that they had. Did the mandate, for example, include sexual violence? Was that one of the crimes that the commission could actually look into? We collected data on who the commissioners were. Did they have gender expertise? Was there a gendered balance commission? Just to give you examples. The second phase was the operations, which means the actual commission report. How did the commission work? Were the victim hearings? What kind of voices were included? Who was heard? How did the data collection for the Truth Commission actually happen? Was there a focus on sexual violence or not? Regardless of what the mandate said, was there a focus? Was there information on sexual violence documented in the report? And then the third phase, or the third part, was looking into the recommendations, examining the recommendations and trying to identify whether there were recommendations regarding conflict-related sexual violence as defined. And then the idea was also to try to look at the implementation of these recommendations, but that is really hard to do in 38 cases without consulting a lot of additional material. We tried, we have some data, but it's not complete. And also bear in mind that every time a commission or any body of inquiry gives a recommendation, it can take a long time before these recommendations are actually implemented. And another thing is, even if something happens upon the recommendations of a Truth Commission, how do we actually know that this is because the Truth Commission said it? And I think Ana will actually get back to this in the Guatemala case. It's like the causal relationships between what is said in a document and what empirically happens is not always clear. So this gives you an idea of the data that we collected. I think we had about, I forget exactly, 167 questions, or maybe even more. Some of them are yes/no questions, and some of them are questions about cataloging different things, where you could put crosses. For example, we asked, did the Truth Commission refer to international legal frameworks, like concrete cases, conventions, reports? We try to document that. So was there an engagement with the international legal understanding, for example, of conflict-related sexual violence? Just to give you some examples of qualitative data that we have collected. Now, qualitative data is a lot harder to compare across 38 cases than the yes/no questions. And right now we are very much trying to figure out the trends and patterns in the data based on the yes/no questions primarily, which we have separated into a separate data set. And then we're going to engage with the empirical qualitative data in much more depth and detail. That's where we're at the moment.
But I also know that you already have some preliminary findings. So tell us about them.
Okay. Very briefly, and then I shall shut up for a little while. Okay, temporarily, we hypothesized when we started the project that changes in the international legal framework, and especially the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, which began in the 2000, so there is a 25th anniversary, was going to actually shape the propensity for truth commissions to deal with conflict-related sexual violence. And this is exactly what we have found, that after 2000, there are more truth commissions, so there are more countries dealing with violations through truth commissions, and the likelihood of truth commissions to address sexual violence steeply increases after 2000. So that's one main finding. A second main finding is that few truth commissions have actually dealt with with sexual violence in their mandates. I can give you the exact figures. I have them. Do you want the exact figures? So not very many have dealt with them in their mandates. It's about a third across the two regions. Almost all of the truth commissions have actually documented sexual violence. And then few truth commissions have made recommendations with respect to sexual violence. So this is like the very general pattern. A third general observation is that African truth commissions overall have engaged much more with sexual violence than the Latin American truth commissions. This is partly a time issue, but it probably, there are many potential explanations for this. One is the timing, before and after 2000. Also the composition of the truth commissions, the commissioners themselves, international expertise, the possibility that countries that have gone through armed conflict are more likely to deal with sexual violence than military dictatorships, although we know that sexual violence was an integrated part of torture in very many countries, so sexual torture across Latin America. So these are some of the explanations that I think we want to dig more into in the qualitative work that we're doing.
Thank you, Elin. And Lesego, can you talk a little bit about what you have been finding in the African context?
So just to kind of continue with Elin, so in terms of the African context, most of the African truth commissions that do exist after the WPS policy agenda will talk about sexual violence and will also adopt the definition. So also when rape is considered, or certain types are considered war crimes or acts of genocide or crimes against humanity, you start seeing truth commissions also adopt that sort of language. So basically, our main question was whether truth commissions do include or address sexual violence, and with the African case studies, you can say yes. So the simple answer to that is yes. But similar to the previous panel, there was a conversation about how. So gender mainstreaming and the sort of language around the international platforms starts increasing, and therefore you see that sort of ripple effect with regional and other sort of institutions. But now you start engaging with the language of how do you actually address conflict-related sexual violence. So I will look at 3 particular cases with 4-year differences. You have Sierra Leone, who has a truth commission between 2002 and 2004. Then you have Kenya, which is 2008 to 2013. And then you have the Gambia, which is 2017 to 2021. With the Sierra Leone case, they actually are quite explicit about adopting these sort of norms or international standards. But you don't also see it completely operationalized. So they only look at a certain type of sexual violence, which is rape. And their findings are that both men and women are perpetrators, but they end up only providing recommendations for women who are victims of sexual violence. And so there's sort of a specific understanding of sexual violence in this context, and only a certain adoption of the understanding. And I think it also speaks to knowledge production at the time. I think to recognize Sierra Leone as one of the first rather cases that go from mandate all the way to implementation or recommendations, it does show a positive projection, basically. But you start seeing with the Kenyan case, they explore a lot more. And so they adopt their own, well, including all these international and regional definitions, they start adopting their own definition around sexual violence, which is a lot more experiences, as you mentioned, like forced pregnancy, forced sterilization, and they actually documented it in different categories. They also document men as victims of sexual violence as well as women as sexual violence, but they limit it to only men being perpetrators. There's not many findings around women being perpetrators or any type of different perpetrator, if you will. And I think both cases still stick to some level of a rape myth of how sexual violence is performed. It's sort of like it needs to be penetrative, it needs to be man, not versus woman, but that sort of idea. Then you see with the Gambian case study, though, it's one of the newer case studies, so finishing in 2021. And if you think about just the mainstream language around sexual violence, it has gotten really big. And you see that with the Gambia, which is quite impressive. I mean, they still have their own limitations, but they start increasing the definition to say that you can be targeted based on your sexual expression or orientation, which is an important inclusion because if you look at particularly the former president, Jammeh, you see that during his presidency, he did target LGBTQ+ or sexual and gender minorities and diverse persons. In spite of that inclusion, though, they don't talk about the violence at all. So it's a bit of an awkward thing of like, it's included, but there's still large silences around people's experiences of conflict. And yeah, so it puts you in a bit of an awkward, like people exist, but not really type of thing. But yeah, I think, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Lesego. Yeah, it's super difficult to go through those information, and it's information that is super important also for direct and informed policy. And that's the question I want to ask you, Pilar. How donors and funding organizations need to take into account this type of insights in their cooperation?
Thank you. Yes. And I think, of course, one of the challenges is how to translate the complexities of the findings and the experiences into language that can be useful for the practitioners, for the policymakers that are funding, programming, funding interventions with the aim of supporting the objective of dealing with these very traumatic and dramatic experiences of conflict and authoritarian rule. So one of the outputs of the project is actually to develop a very modest handbook on what are the implications of all of this for policymakers and practitioners, but not only for funders, more generally to take this to the conversation across different communities of practice, including international and national NGOs, but also across different thematic communities of practice that work in very siloed ways and don't interact or engage with each other in ways that could more effectively inform these conversations. So it's not just those working on human rights or transitional justice that are relevant for thinking about the issues that this project has covered, but also those that are engaging in peace building, in transitions from conflict, those organizations that work on violence against women and sexual and gender-based violence, not only on conflict. And the fact is that they really do not speak to each other, and that knowledge and experience is very siloed across these not only disciplinary but thematic areas that the practitioner and policy worlds engage with. So one of the key points about that the project focuses on in terms of what the implications are of these findings for the practitioner community is that there is a need to move away from the logic and narrative of best practice to something that maybe we can call best fit, what works best in ways that takes into account context specificity, all the complexities that the findings point to, and to move away from very top-down narratives and models about what should be, rather than what is politically plausible and what is possible given the complexities and dynamics of transition politics and post-transition, post-peace-building experiences. So in this move to best fit, there is a need for international actors to be much more dynamic and to take on a logic of adaptation and flexibility. But let's also remind ourselves that it's not that international practitioners and policymakers are so simplistic that they don't understand the complexities of context. They do. And moreover, they invest quite a lot of resources into commissioning political economy analyses that engage with these complexities, but then they don't know what to do with that analysis and that knowledge that they've paid for, and that echoes some of the findings that come out from this research. So what are those challenges that really limits their capacity to engage much more effectively with these issues? First of all, there's always the question of turnover in these organizations. People move on quite quickly into other parts of their organization, so knowledge doesn't accumulate often. That's particularly so for donor organizations and funding organizations, much less so for international NGOs or local NGOs that may remain focused on the knowledge that they hold and that gets consolidated or developed and evolved in ways that take into account the questions that we asked. But there are also other logics, organizational logics, which have to do with organizational rigidity. It's quite difficult to integrate this logic of adaptation, of flexibility, into programming dynamics where there is a compelling pressure to focus on results, on what should be and what donors should try and achieve, results that are top-down rather than focused on the process and what is possible. There are also challenges or features about specifically the transitional justice space and the Truth Commission space, which reflects some of the following. Some of this has been reflected in the previous panel. But first of all, transitional justice, as is also true of other human rights issues, is deeply, deeply normative. These communities of practice are very attached to often maximalist ambitions about what can be achieved. And often it's those expectations and ambitions that motivate, or that I express particularly at the early stages of the Truth Commission process that Elin was talking about. So that moving into what's politically plausible becomes quite difficult. Imagining what, and accepting the fact that context is complex, that it creates all kinds of limitations and boundaries that limit those ambitions and objectives is difficult. And then, of course, from that normative perspective, donors might think, okay, this is really what we need to do because these objectives are what we're funding. But sometimes they lose sight of, taking into account the complexities of context, their commitment to do no harm in ways that take into account ongoing vulnerabilities, the fact of reversals in the conflict dynamics, the fact of ongoing violences that contribute to the silencing and that contribute to really the risks of re-victimization and re-traumatization. But in addition to being a deeply normative agenda, it's of course inevitably deeply political. So throughout these processes and the different stages that Elin was referring to, it's fundamental that the balance of power between all the different stakeholders that are affected by truth commissions and truth-telling specifically, but also more generally the dynamics of transitional justice, is that means that we need to take into account if not only the balance of power at the time of negotiating a truth commission, but also at the fact that that balance of power is continually evolving and affects the experience of each of the different stages of truth commissions. So in addition to taking into account the fact of this shifting balance of power, therefore a central aspect of what, or central component of what international actors need to engage with is that these are dynamic processes, and in being dynamic, it puts into question those initial results frameworks that they may have integrated into programming, which become check boxes that result in narratives of success and failure. These narratives are not helpful given this dynamic process and the fact of shifting power dynamics, and that different stakeholders evolve in their capacity for influence. Spoilers at different stages might come back or come back with the capacity for influence, or from the beginning maybe limiting what's possible. So what can the international community aim for, or what should it aim for? Rather than dictating the logic and ambitions and objectives of what Truth Commissions should achieve, their role should be fundamentally that of facilitating dialogue, paying for, contributing to the resourcing of those aspects that maybe normatively are the ones that are aimed for not only by them, but those communities of practice that have experienced conflict-related sexual violence, taking into account Lesego's points, obviously, about the complexities of this and the structural and historical nature of these experiences. And that requires integrating structurally and organizationally the capacity to adapt, to be flexible from the beginning, and to integrate fundamentally not only as a knowledge question, but as something that should inform practice, the complexities of context, and in that respect also the changing dynamics of the very different stages of the Truth Commission and truth-telling experience. This requires changes in mindsets, even if they're mindful of the complexities of context and the need to engage with. The fact is that there still continue to be mindsets of actually we know better, or actually, and that reproduces that rigidity of thinking about, in the end, we need to measure ourselves by success and by preset notions of success. So that needs to be reflected on in an ongoing and critical way by all those organizations that are funding these processes, but also by non-funding organizations, international NGOs, local NGOs. And they need to engage with the relevant stakeholders in a much more attentive way and learning mindset that takes into account those narratives that come from below and from those affected communities, those that have experienced human rights violations, but here specifically victims and survivors of conflict-related sexual violence, and to really be mindful and reflective throughout and in a dynamic way of their not only objective but commitment, the need for commitment to do no harm, to ensuring that they're not contributing to harmful effects of these processes. There are questions also about how they use knowledge and who's producing knowledge and how that gets interpreted into maybe how even this adaptive agenda might evolve. There's academic knowledge, and we're very much contributing that, but also there's the knowledge that comes from the ground, and how can that inform these policy and practitioner efforts to engage constructively in this facilitative role. So how do they measure results, and how do they measure impact? And in that respect, the future is unknown, precisely because of the fact that these are changing contexts where we never know if things will be moving forward, or in fact whether conflict may resurface, or other violence dynamics continue in ways that affect the agenda of addressing these traumatic experiences of conflict-related sexual violence. And I think, Ana, you want to take up the question of impact.
Yeah, thank you. You have touched on that. Actually, we have until 1:30, so we have time yet. And I think you did a wonderful transition to talk a little bit about the Guatemalan case, which is one of the two in-depth cases in Latin America, Guatemala and Colombia. There is a report written by our colleague Irma Alicia Velázquez Nimatuj, who is a Maya Quiche anthropologist, and among many other skills that she has. And she wrote for this project a report that actually corresponds to the post-transitional justice period. Guatemala, which has had a truth commission after the peace accords in the 90s, la Comisión de Esclarecimiento Histórico, and it released the report, the national report, in 1999, where many testimonies were collected on related on sexual violence during the conflict war, and that's why it's important, I think, the role of donors and international cooperation, because the result, the unexpected result of the Truth Commission in Guatemala 30 years later was the putting together important alliances between practitioners and advocates, and also indigenous women activists on the ground, and decided to pursue strategic litigation. And until now, there's been 5 cases on transitional justice, specifically regarding sexual violence during the armed conflict. And what these cases revealed was the systematic use of sexual slavery, forced prostitution, sexual mutilation, sexual torture, and other forms of sexual abuse as weapons of war against not only but mainly indigenous Maya women and girls. And what is important also is that this long history of armed conflict and a transitional justice moment, post-transitional moment, is that these cases revealed the long-lasting history of colonial violence in the form of patriarchy and racist during armed conflict. And after 30 years of the Truth Commission in Guatemala, the Agency for Indigenous Women and the Liberation of the World has been very important, and opened. It's a pity that Ruth Rubio Marin is not here, but the organization she supports orients the efforts into the healing and into the being able of speaking out about the things that happened. So now we are wrapping up with this session, and waiting for you to line up, I will read a poem of Irma Alicia Velázquez Nimatuj, who was an expert in most of these cases related of sexual violence, and she's also a poet because she needs to transform the anger and the frustration into words that mean something, and this is one of her poems. Tombstone. You sealed me alive with a tombstone above me. You tried to kill my hope, to close off any possibility of escape. You even tried to take away the possibility of dreaming. There was no escape possible. You enclosed all room for maneuver. You abolished rationality. You demanded my surrender in exchange for my liberation. But I managed to limit my movements, control my movements, and without you realizing it, I stopped dragging the chains. So this is to honor Irma Alicia.
Thanks for those really good questions, which are ones that in any case we need to take into account, and some of them are already part of the challenges that we're trying to face. Let me just reflect on a couple of them. The question of the impact of the women, peace and security is important. In some respects goes towards answering or explaining the question of why, and particularly in the case of Africa, more recently, truth commissions have been much more effective, or are taking into account conflict-related sexual violence, and increasingly taking into account the complexities of that, and needing to move towards move away from a women and girls focus to one that takes gender more widely into account. The instrumental use of women's organizations and organizations of victims and survivors of both the women, peace and security agenda, but also other international norms that have evolved in conjunction with the women, peace and security agenda is, of course, politically important. But it's also really important to underline that this international agenda that's developed, particularly since the end of the 1990s, and the Women, Peace and Security Agenda from 2000 onwards, both through Security Council Resolution 1325 and subsequent Security Council resolutions, is in itself an outcome of effective advocacy and mobilization by women's organizations and victims' organizations, both at the national level, at the regional level, and international level. So there's an important exchange there and interaction there that is contributing to this thickening of the narrative and discourse and understanding, or need to understand and engage with this aspect of trauma and this experience of violence during conflict or authoritarian rule. Yes, sorry. So I'll stop there.
I will directly deal with the question on Gambia, and it kind of mixes with the whole breaking cycles of trauma as well as violence. Not that we want to use best practices, but with the Gambia, I think what was very different compared to all the other cases was the fact that they focused on power. So you had other cases that were primarily just focusing on the idea that conflict is the reason why certain violences were being practiced, and this is why sexual violence, and it's kind of just very specific. But what the Gambia did was, I mean, also the final report also looks at the Gambia as it was a democracy from its independence, which is not the same for all the other cases. And so therefore they already had like sexual violence bills and women bills and all these other things. But with the Gambia, what it did is that it looked at power as a means of violence, that people were being particularly targeted if the power was unequal. So it was gender related, it was racial, it was class related. That's why you had different aspects of how sexual violence could be practiced, if you will. So I think that was, I guess, the most impressive, because you started talking about language around coercion, exploitation, more than just the random take, I guess. And that's also kind of how you talk to cycles of trauma and violence. You need to get to the root of it, because oftentimes truth commissions and other instruments will look at aftermath and look at how do we deal with what has happened in terms of these set times. But if you start looking at things like power and inequality and just social relations before the violence, then you're able to actually engage with that more.
Okay, very quickly to Livia. I think the answer is no. But I can go and check again if there have been any recommendations on abortion. I can't remember having seen any. To the last question, the involvement of CSVR, conflict-related sexual violence over time. Absolutely. I mean, who victims are, how you define violations. These are things that we can actually see when we look at the truth commissions over time, how they define it, how they operationalize it, what kind of victims are included and excluded. So, for example, LGBT wasn't mentioned once in the 1980s. Didn't happen, probably didn't exist as a concept. So we see that international debates actually do influence how truth commissions think about sexual violence. The connections to the last panel, you know what, rather than spend more time, I want to thank you for all the good questions. And you have given us things to think about and concrete truth commissions that we should look closer into, particularly the Gambia and the Colombia, in terms of seeing how they have organized themselves and brought in women's voices and other victims' voices in the whole process, from the formulation of the mandate throughout the operations and the recommendations, to see how they've actually influenced the work of the commissions. And I think when we develop the handbook further, a lot of the concrete measures that we will use as examples are likely to come from these two commissions, along with quite another few. So thank you all.